Ghost stories. Fact or fiction? Real or fake? The idea of the supernatural has been around for centuries. This city was founded in 1749, which makes it one of the oldest in all of Canada. Halifax has seen its share of devastation. In 1917, it saw the world's largest man-made explosion, the Halifax explosion, which killed 2,000 and then mortified 9,000 others. It's no wonder ghost stories are rampant in this city. So today, we're here meeting with 902 Vlogs to explore the history and the mystery surrounding ghost stories right here at Citadel Hill.
As we made our way into the central area of the Citadel, we began discussing ghosts in general. It's a topic met with mixed emotions and level of belief. What are your opinions of ghosts? Do you believe in them? We asked these questions to ourselves, and here's what we thought.
I do, to an extent. I feel like in some scenarios, people they hear this weird sound and they just automatically assume it's a ghost. But I love hearing about these old ghost stories in places that are really historical, and I love hearing about the past stories. So I do believe to an extent, but maybe not every story that we hear is real. That's pretty much what I'll say.
Yeah, and have you had any personal
I've never
experiences?
had a personal experience. I don't know if I really want to. It would definitely be a unique experience, but I think I'll stay away from that if possible.
I believe ghosts exist, and actually I never seen before, but I sometimes feel ghosts. They're invisible, but I can feel they're a ghost. I had experience when I was in Japan working at hotel, which is a old traditional style hotel in Japan, and the place where kids was die due to accident. And I never seen, but I felt something, and I felt cold air. So I think the boy was in the room.
So, if you were to ask me a couple years ago if I were to believe in ghosts, I would have said no, absolutely not. You ask me today, and my mind is starting to change. One of the things that kind of really sparked my interest in it is during our trip to Mexico. There was 4 of us that went, and on one of our hikes we went into this small town, and it's a Pueblo Magico, which is a kind of a mystic town. And at the top of this hill was a temple devoted to one of the gods. And there was a series of steps and a small hike that we had to go up in order to get there. And on either side, it was nothing but solid natural rock wall. So there's nothing that could have come from either side. When we got to the top, we couldn't get in because it was all gated up as it was getting dark. So we turned around, and on the way down, it was getting so dark that we had to use our cell phones. And 2 of our friends started falling behind. And so myself and my friend Adam, we went down farther. And we saw this guy climbing up, which was really kind of strange. So we proceeded down, we watched him for a little while, and then we looked to go and see where our friends were. And by the time we turned around, he was gone. And I asked Adam, I'm like, you did see him, didn't you? And he says, yes, of course I saw him. And we searched and searched just to make sure, and none of us could find him.
Prepped to hear about 5 incredible ghost stories, we followed our guide. We first headed to a wall which faced the Halifax Harbor. It was a perfect evening for ghost stories. It was a cool, crisp November night. The wind was still, an oddity here in Halifax. We made our way up to the front side of the fort, to a location on top of the wall, allowing us to peer out and over the city for our first story.
So the first story that we have this evening is personally actually one of my favorite stories here. As far as obscure ghost stories go, it is one of our more famous ones, if that makes any sense. We like to tell it right here at what we call the signal post, because this is actually the closest spot in the fort you can get to it. It happened just on the other side of Sackville Street in what's now Royal Artillery Park. But at the time of this story, it was just officers' barracks. In 1782, there were 2 young officers staying there by the names of Ensign Wineyard and Ensign Sherbrooke. Ensign Wineyard is actually the namesake of this story, as we come to call it the Wineyard story. But these 2 young officers, they were staying in this barracks, and they were actually there more or less alone. There were a few other people in the barracks, but it was a late night. Being ensigns, they were actually quite young boys, so the rest of the officers, most of them, were out drinking, leaving a very quiet, almost empty barracks. As these 2 young officers are sitting there in this reading room connected to Mr. Wineyard's room, the door on the other side that connects to the rest of the barracks actually blows wide open. And standing there is this tall, gaunt-faced man. He's wearing tattered hunting clothes. He looks like he's been in some sort of accident, more important than all, but his eyes have also gone pale, just like the rest of his skin. And without a single word, he walks past these 2 young officers, opens the door to Mr. Wineyard's bedroom, and slams the door behind him, without so much as even acknowledging them. Mr. Sherbrooke, he's offended at this, and he thinks that, well, it would be totally unacceptable to barge into an officer's room like this. So he wants to go and apprehend whoever this was. Given that there's no other exit from the officer's bedroom, aside from the door that they're currently looking at, he knows that whoever this is must still be in there. Ensign Wineyard, however, has a bit of a different reaction. He goes a little pale himself, and he starts pointing at the door, and eventually stammers out. He says, that's not possible. That is my brother Jack. But Jack lives in London. And the problem with, well, him living in London is that London is about 6 weeks away by sail. And also, the harbour, the mouth of it, is encased in ice, which means not only is it too far of a distance for him to have shown up completely unannounced like this, there's also no way for him to actually have gotten into the harbour, given the fact that travel was blocked. So Ensign Sherbrooke, he says, well, obviously, this cannot be your brother Jack. This has to be someone else. There's no other way out of this room. Let's go and apprehend him. And the 2 rush into Ensign Wineyard's bedroom, and they're immediately met with no one. They don't see anything. And they look around a little more. They check underneath the bed, they open the wardrobe, they search the room, and they still don't find anyone. Next, their attention actually gets drawn to a window in the very back of the room. And they quickly realize that there's no way that they could have escaped, anyone could have escaped through that room either. Because, well, the window itself was puttied in for the winter, preventing it from opening. And then they also look outside and they notice that there are no other footprints on the hill. There's nothing leading away from the window, which means no one could have gotten through this window. Now the 2 young officers, they look at each other and they decide that, well, they're going to keep this quiet. It's not really a good career move if you go around telling everyone in the regiment that you saw a ghost. They'd end up as the laughing stock of their regiment. So they keep this quiet. However, Ensign Wineyard himself believes that something has happened to his brother. Something dreadful. Now weeks go by, and given that the harbor has been frozen over around the mouth, close to McNabb's Island, no messages have been able to get into the city. Eventually, what they start doing, the ships that are carrying light cargo, such as letters, they pull right up as close as they can to these sheets of ice, and they actually toss their cargo out onto the ice. Soldiers are then sent to go and pick up these letters and bring them into the city, and there's nothing for Mr. Wineyard, not a single letter. More weeks go by, and the same thing happens again, and once more, there is nothing for Mr. Wineyard. And even more weeks go by. A third time, a ship comes in that has some letters for the city, And while there is nothing from Mr. Wineyard yet again this time, there is one letter from Mr. John Sherbrooke. And this letter is actually explaining to him that the Wineyard family would like him to be the one to break this awful news to Mr. Wineyard that his brother Jack was killed in a hunting accident. And they look at the date on this letter, and it's actually none other than January 6th, which was the exact day that they saw that apparition in what's now Royal Artillery Park here in Halifax.
The story of seeing loved ones is a common theme among those who have a ghost story. Do we see people we know because they visit us, or because that's what our brain does to help process the loss? I'm not one to say. But what if the person is someone, well, more famous? Would we see them too? That's the topic of our next story.
So this next story we have is what we've taken to calling the Duc d'Unveils story. And to properly tell it, we actually have to go all the way back to 1746. And this was before the city of Halifax, as we see here today, was actually founded. In 1746, there was one large interesting event that did happen here. What was happening at the time was France and Britain were at war with each other, which was more or less a constant during this era of history. What France wanted to do is send this huge invasion fleet across the North Atlantic. They had about 15,000 soldiers on board. They were going to sail across the North Atlantic and land in what they knew as the Chebucto Harbor, but what we now know as the Halifax Harbor. A few things went wrong during this expedition. The original plan, as I said, was to sail across the Atlantic. They were to land here, meet up with a force from Quebec, and then they would go and seize these big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so on, that at the time the British still owned. Now, living in real life, we know that this didn't work. But why it didn't work is interesting in its own right. As they were sailing across the North Atlantic, numerous things went wrong. There was outbreaks of disease, there was a shortage of supplies, they had bad weather conditions that ended up blowing a lot of their ships off course, and they had to spend a lot of extra time actually getting here. But by the time they did get here, they've lost about 5,000 soldiers before they even made landfall. They're already down a third of their original force. But they do make it here, and they immediately set up their camp, and their camp stretches from what's now just about Lower Water Street all the way to Bedford. It was this one massive row of tents all the way to Bedford from just down the waterline. As the journals and reports that these soldiers were writing describes, the man in charge, a man named Admiral Duc d'Unveils, he made his headquarters on the very peak of the largest hill westwards of the water, which we now nowadays as Citadel Hill, and the peak of Citadel Hill before the fort was built was none other than where we're standing right now. While they were here, and they're making their camp, that force from Quebec I mentioned shows up next, and they're in just as bad of a state themselves, and they turn back around and head home. More soldiers from that original expedition from France are still dying while they're here, including Admiral Duc d'Unveils himself, who died in his headquarters. Which means that one of us here tonight might be standing where Admiral Duc d'Unveils died. He was then buried on George's Island, and then the rest of the force, the remaining 5,000, they packed up and went home. And how many of them actually made it home? I don't have an exact number, but I'm not very optimistic. Now, going forward to about the late 1850s, there was a lot of reports of one particular sighting here in Halifax. At this point, newspapers were a booming business in the area, and in dozens of different newspapers reported by hundreds of people, there was the same event described. People said that they saw this eerie fog creep in from the mouth of the harbor inwards, so going out from that way towards us. And as it's starting to engulf George's Island and Fort Charlotte, they saw someone walking around out there. Someone wearing this elaborate uniform. That would be, well, way fancier than anything the Royal Artillery would have been wearing on the island, who would have been the personnel responsible for the island. They would have been dressed just about how I'm dressed tonight, and the described uniform had a lot more gold and lace on it, which is something that they would not have been wearing. So he definitely stuck out, is what I'm trying to say. And as the fog rolled in more, and the harbor, the island rather, was fully engulfed, they say that this figure walked into the water, and as the fog engulfed the waterfront itself, this man appeared there as well. And then he walked around the waterfront, pale, non-responsive, where eventually he found his way back to the water, and with him the fog dissipated. Now, many people believe that that is either the apparition of Duke d'Anville, or perhaps one of Halifax's earliest urban legends, or maybe just a case of mass hysteria. But what's absolutely true, and what is actually more unsettling to me personally, is the aftermath of that expedition I described earlier. It was just roughly 3 years after that force left was when the first settlers of Halifax showed up here. And they would have been fed propaganda for months and months now, being told things like, the king wants you to live here, this is a beautiful, beautiful area. Most importantly of all, the king wants you to live here. But then the first thing that they saw when they got here was a dozen shipwrecks and thousands of skeletons lying across the waterfront.
Our third story takes us from the top of the wall to inside them. Working our way through the maze of tunnels located in, around, and under the hill, we ended up outside in a large ditch which separates the exterior from the interior of the fort.
So this story down here in the defensive ditch, to properly tell it, we actually have to talk a little bit about the bridge that we all walked through to get into the fort today first. That bridge historically was the only way in or out of the fort, and at the end of it was a sentry who was posted there day and night. When they were out there for 2 hours at a time, and then back inside for 4 hours, and then back out for 2. There's a little myth about that sentry, is that they cannot move at all. Now that's wrong. They actually can move in a few ways, but what's important to us is a maneuver that's known as taking a beat. It's when they would turn around and they would take 15 paces, then they'd turn back around and take another 15 to resume their original spot. But why that's important to us right now is that 15th pace brings us to right around where the white wooden railing and the metal railing meet together, just about 2/3 of the way down the bridge. And from there, the sentry actually has a decent view into the ditch here. One particular sentry, he was posted at about 4 a.m. And it was quite dark, so he wasn't able to see much, but he takes that beat that I mentioned, and he notices that there is something laying in the grass, just over there, around the bend of the wall. Now, sentries aren't really paid to think, they're just paid to do, so he turns back around and he resumes his post, but he remembers that there is something there that he's never noticed it before. It's something new. Over the course of the next 2 hours, he takes those beats again and again, and whatever it is that he's seeing here has not moved since the start of his post. All the way up until just about 6 a.m. He's just about to be taken off and switched out with someone else, when finally he is able to see something here in the ditch. And he sees a woman in a long gray tattered dress lying face down in the grass. And this alarms him, and he goes and he calls out for the corporal of the guard, who would have just been on the other end of the tunnel inside. The corporal and a different sentry that would have been brought out of the guard room, they rush down here through this sally port behind all of you, and they rush over to investigate because, well, they see a woman lying down here in the ditch. And as they go over and investigate, they notice two things about her just about immediately. First is that very evidently she has come off the top of the wall, right up there. And then the next thing they notice is that it was not the fall that killed her. What evidently killed her was the large slash through her throat. The next thing they do is they raise the entire fort to high alert. What that entails is, among other things, waking up every single soldier in the fort and forming them up for roll call. Given that the soldiers were actually locked inside their barracks at nighttime, when they were all present and accounted for, that means it couldn't have been any of them. And next, they start to form patrols and they search the entire fort head to toe. And again, they don't find anything. There's not a whole lot of places you could be hiding in this fort, partially because every single room would have been either locked, occupied, or both. And they aren't able to find anything. And the next thing they do is they hand this scenario over to the police in Halifax. And they aren't able to do anything either. It clearly isn't a military manor anymore because the woman in question has no association with the regiment. She's not the wife of a soldier, she's not part of the staff, no one knows who she is. The first thing the police try and do is put out posters to have someone come and identify her. And no one ever came to identify her. And unfortunately, this story has no clean resolution. That is where the trail has run cold ever since. To this very day, she has never been identified. No one even knows who she is. Really, the first time that anyone knows they saw her was when they were found dead at the bottom of that wall.
An unknown woman? An unfazed guard? You beg to wonder if this was a ghost story or a crime scene. Either way, it's not something I would have wanted to be a part of. Back in the safety of the fort, we headed to the barracks, home of the men living on site, protecting the fort and the city. Surely nothing bad could have happened here.
So, where we're standing now, this is the second floor of the Cavalier building, or the balcony of the Cavalier building. What's interesting about this particular spot that we're standing around is that this is actually where one of our more famous ghosts, you could say, is most often sighted. This ghost is so prevalent that we've actually given her a name. We've decided to title her the Grey Lady. Where she likes to hang out is right in front of me, right here, against this railing, and she likes to look out over the parade square. From where we're standing right now, you can see the security office. They're just over there. But what's more important is that they can see us. So the commissionaires, who would be the actual guards of this fort, they like to look out their window just before they do their rounds, and what they'll often see is a lady standing right here wearing a long white flowing dress. Then they walk out of their office and they blow their whistle at her and they say, "Oh, excuse me, ma'am, the fort's actually closed right now, you're going to have to leave." To which she doesn't do anything. She just stays put. Then the commissionaire walks out across the yard, just down there in front of, well, where I'd be standing. And then they call out again. They go, "Excuse me, ma'am, the fort's closed right now, you can't be here, I'm gonna have to show you out." And again, she doesn't do anything. And then next, the commissionaire, after once again not getting an answer, follows the same path that we took to get up here, right up this set of stairs over here to my right, to come and find her. But when they get to the top of those stairs, she's nowhere to be found. But there's a few small issues of where possibly could she have gone. There is another set of stairs on the far end over that way, but that's quite the distance to make in just the time it takes for someone to clear that flight of stairs. And even if you did take off at the fastest you can possibly run, there's a bit of a problem with this floor. It's a very, very loud floor to walk on. So if you were to take off at a full-on sprint to get to the other end there, you'd be waking up people on Brunswick Street, and then they'd be asking what's going on. So there's no way that she escaped out that way. And then the next possibility is that she actually went farther up this flight of stairs. But that leads directly into the third floor, and that's where Park Canada keeps their offices here. And those doors are kept locked just about always. So she couldn't have gone up there either. And then for obvious reasons, she couldn't have gone down the same flight of stairs that the commissionaire came up. Now, reports like this that I just described to you have been seen every once in a while ever since about the early 1960s, when the commissioners first took over here. I've heard this story from dozens of different commissioners, probably around 100 times at this point. One year, not too long ago, someone decided to do a little bit of research to see if we could connect this story to anything else that has happened in this area. And funny enough, it actually does fit very perfectly into another story that happened in the Halifax Citadel. In 1903, there was a brigade of Royal Artillery that were stationed here. This was actually before the Canadians fully took over, so it was a British force that was here, and one of the side effects of that is that they were rotated around different areas quite a lot, and this particular group, they came from Bermuda just a few years before they were here. And among them was someone named Sergeant Major Edwards. And Sergeant Major Edwards, of course, he would have lived here in the Citadel in the garrison, but he was also supposed to be married here in Halifax not terribly long after the brigade showed up. They were to be married in a church in the North End, which would just be over there. It's actually right where the Staples is nowadays. It was called Trinity Church. And the ceremony was supposed to start at about 5 o'clock. And as 5 o'clock approaches, he is nowhere to be seen. No one at the wedding has seen him yet. The wedding party sends a messenger up to the top of the hill to come and find him, because for obvious reasons it would be rude to be late to your own wedding. And the messenger gets to the top of the hill, and the sentry out front stops him. And he goes, "Who goes there? What is your business?" And the messenger replies that he's here to find Sergeant Major Edwards, that he's supposed to be married right now, but he's nowhere to be found, and if he doesn't come with him right away, he's going to be late to his own wedding. And at this, the sentry goes a little grim, and he goes, "Oh, you haven't heard yet. Sergeant Major Edwards, he's dead. He shot himself outside his own barracks this morning." The messenger runs back to the church and explains to the wedding party that the groom is not going to be attending. The bride, she's actually quite outraged at this. She at first doesn't believe it, and her family eventually had to take her away to their family home to calm her down, because she was in such a fit at this horrible news. Then a little bit later, dug out of the same series of newspaper articles that we were able to drag that from, we found a follow-up to it that explains even more about Sergeant Major Edwards. Before he was before the wedding was supposed to take place, he was actually seen downtown shopping for something, and what he was buying was especially peculiar, you could say. He was shopping for coffins downtown, which is a strange enough thing to do in its own right, especially before a wedding. But it's made even stranger when you find out what coffin he bought. He bought a coffin that matched the decor of his wedding. And he was buried in that coffin. He's still a resident of Halifax to this day. But more information came out about him as well. Someone decided to do their research into this. His peers in the army were interviewed, and they revealed that when they were in Bermuda, he was already married. Now, when people asked him, when he was to be married here in Halifax, when people asked him what that was about, he never was able to quite keep the story straight. To some, he would say that they were divorced before they left, or that she died. But what was actually true was that his wife was still alive, and they were still married, but she was, before they left, condemned to an asylum and left behind in Bermuda. They weren't able to take her with them. So many people think that what drove him to do what he did here was actually the guilt of marrying someone else while still being married to his first wife. One thing that I haven't mentioned until now is that we actually know exactly where his barracks was. It was said that he shot himself just outside his barracks, and we know exactly where it was. It was none other than this room that I've been standing in front of this whole tale. Do I have any volunteers to come and touch where Sergeant Major Edwards died?
I will, yeah.
You're officially haunted. You get to bring home a free ghost.
Here you go.
Free ghost, all to yourself.
I'll bring it home.
Now, how this connects to the Grey Lady that I started off with here is that the description of what she's wearing very, very closely matches a wedding dress. So many people believe that it is the lingering spirit of Sergeant Major Edwards' bride. So this room in here, this is the guard room, and earlier in many stories I've so far talked about the sentries. And this room in here is actually where those sentries were stored, as I like to say, whenever they weren't active and outside. But what, other than that, is unique about this room is that it's one of the very few rooms that has a well built into the floor. And that well is right over there in that corner. I'm going to open that up in just a moment. Another thing about this garrison, this area, is that not all the soldiers actually live inside the fort. A good deal of them were married, and they were living in what's known as family barracks down on kind of the northern side of Brunswick Street. At the time, they would have been called Barracks Street. These family barracks were not built very luxuriously, and they were overall built quite cheaply, really. And as a side effect of this, when they caught fire and went up, they really went up. And such a thing did happen one day. It was actually Christmas Eve in the mid-1850s. And the fire engulfed the barracks. Thankfully, I can say, no one was critically injured in this fire. But one thing that did happen is the guard detachment were rushing in and out of this room, all over the place, because this particular guard detachment, one of its jobs was to raise the alarm in case of a fire, and they were often mobilized and sent out to help put out that fire. So there would have been soldiers storming in and out of this room constantly as they were rushing downtown to go and put out this fire. And where they would have been getting the water from was, of course, none other than this well over here. At the end of the night, when finally the fire was defeated and all the soldiers were heading back to their barracks, the guard detachment was brought together for a roll call, just to make sure no one's run off. Because just for the same reasons that the soldiers were locked in their barracks, they needed to be kept an eye on because desertion was a big deal back then. So when they get back together and they do that roll call, it's immediately noticeable one person's missing. And that person is none other than the sergeant who should have been calling the roll call. He was nowhere to be found. So they assumed that he must have taken his chance and deserted. He ran off. And they spent some time looking for him. But they don't find him anywhere, which means he must have already made it out of town. He must have already gone away. So they spend some time searching for that sergeant, but of course to no avail. Months go by and the sergeant never comes up. They never find him. Someone else is promoted to take his place. And months go by. And it's early into March when finally they discover where their sergeant went. In the months between this well right here started protruding this foul odor, and very occasionally this black ooze is found dragged up with their water. But that's all put to rest when finally they do drag up a whole piece of sergeant. And they discover very immediately that they have been a bit closer with their sergeant these past few months than they would have liked, because he very much has ended up at the bottom of this well here. Now, there's a bit of a debate on how this sergeant has ended up to the bottom of the well. Some think that in the confusion there would have been water spilled all over this floor, he would have been walking around, and he simply slipped and he fell to the bottom of the well. It's about 150 feet deep, and sergeants, they aren't very light on gear when they're wearing their full battle dress or their full marching order as it's called. It's very possibly sank straight to the bottom. However, some people have a bit of a different theory, is that being a drill sergeant, one of the privates that would have been in this area had enough of it, and they ran him through with a bayonet and pushed him in the well to hide him. But the second they found the sergeant at the bottom of the well, they condemned it, and it was never used for any purposes again. But what is true is that his body was never recovered. And to this day, it still has not been recovered. Now, I'm told that at this point, every piece of his body would have eroded away. There would be nothing left. But you still can't say that any remains of that sergeant is at the bottom of this well.
As we wrapped up our night, we headed back to the gate. Preparing to leave, our guide had one last story to tell, and it's one for the books.
So the final story that I have tonight, I think it's a very fitting story to end on, and I've made it a bit of a tradition to end my tours with it. Because it happened not only right here at this very gate, it happened to me personally at the very end of October 2018. We actually very recently passed the 2-year anniversary of this story. But what it was like that night, it was particularly busy. The end of October is always very, very busy for us. And there were quite a few guides in. On top of that, we noticed it was a very windless night, just like tonight. And why that's so notable to us is that these lanterns that we're carrying around get blown out very, very easily. That, and also just given how cold it is, we noticed very, very quickly that it was a very, very nice night, given that there's no wind. Now, later at the end of the night, I actually just finished my tour. I wrapped up and I let them go, and I went to open this gate here behind me. And I open it up, I let them go, and I come back here just to deal with all these lanterns. I would have a full roster of lanterns to blow out and clean up and take inside. And as I'm doing this, the gate behind me starts ricketing back and forth and back and forth. Now, there's this massive deadbolt that's keeping it shut, and it weighs probably about half as much as I do. So I know that nothing short of destroying the hinges of this gate is actually going to blow it over. But I'm sitting here looking at it a little bewildered as it's just shaking back and forth. It's like there's someone on the outside grabbing onto it and just shaking it. And then a moment later, the door blows wide open. The deadbolt somehow gave way and blew wide open. I stand there looking at it for a moment before rushing down to close it, because the fort's closed. I know that I need to keep the gate shut. And I rush out there to close it, and I see that there's actually another group down in the ditch just outside the musketry gallery, all looking up at me. It was one of the fellow tour guides, and they're all looking up at me, silent, like they just saw something weird. And the guide of that group, she looks up at me and gives me this sort of "what on earth are you doing" shrug, to which I just shrug back, a little confused, and shut the gate. And then I come back out here and I finish cleaning up those lanterns. Then I notice that same group, a few minutes after this, they're on their way out as well. And I see that guide bringing her group up here. And I run inside and hide. Then that group leaves, and I come outside to talk to the guide, and I go, what was that? What was out there banging on the door? And she looks at me, confused, and she goes, "What do you mean outside? There was something at the inside of the gate banging on it. We thought it was you." And I go, "No, I was standing right here, wondering what was outside banging on the door." Now, to this day, neither of us have seen that since, but we've both seen it from a different perspective, and neither of us have actually, really any clue what it could be. It certainly couldn't have been the wind, because not only was there no wind that night, it was very, very apparent. If it was wind strong enough to blow open the gate and I was standing right here, certainly it would have been at least strong enough for me to feel, if not blow me completely over. But on that note, this is the final story of the night.
A ghost story is just a tale of the imagination until it happens to you. It's that moment where we start to question the thought of an afterlife. It's the moment where we start to question what may be living on this planet with us that we simply cannot see. Ghost stories are a topic I would love to cover in other videos. If you have a ghost story and would like to share, please leave a comment below or message us on our website at joshuatravelguy.ca.